Thank you very, very much, Anthony. And it's a great honor to be invited here today to talk to you and launching into an extremely exciting looking program that you've got over the next couple of days. Now, just about 2,500 years ago, that's a good place to start, in a sacred grove of olive trees just outside Athens, Plato established his academy, the very first academy, a place of discussion and learning. And that academy gave its name to academic education, separate from practical skills. And it commanded respect, that academy. Even the Spartans left the grove untouched when they invaded Attica. And the olive grove survived until the more pragmatic Roman general Sulla came along, and he cut down all the olive trees in order to build siege engines. And we're here to talk about employer engagement in education, and that's sometimes seen as a threat to the academic world, a bit like Sulla taking an axe to the sacred olive grove. Now, as Anthony mentioned, what I've been doing over the last decade is to be traveling all over the world. It's been an enormous privilege, and look at vocational education and training systems, skills development systems, and looking at countries as diverse as China and Costa Rica or Iceland or England. They face hugely different challenges, as you might imagine. But despite all that difference, all the diversity, there is one remarkably constant theme, and it's astonishing, really, that you find it in. It's not just common across all the countries, it's universal. There's not a single country where you don't find it as a big issues. The need to work with employers. And it's hard. And that matters. It really matters because you just can't build skills systems, education and training systems that meet the needs of the labor market, that help people into good jobs without dialogue, without engagement, and without partnership with the people that are actually going to use those skills, in other words, employers. So if it's such a great idea, this employer engagement stuff, why is it so hard? And the answer I would give in 3 words is culture, institutions, and economics. And in each of those 3 areas, there are barriers. There are cultural barriers, institutional barriers, and economic barriers. And what I'm going to do in the next 20 minutes is to talk a little bit about the barriers in those 3 areas and also what we can do to overcome them. Now, let me start with culture. Plato started something rather important in that olive grove. Education and the education industry are some of the most successful of all human innovations. But that very success has brought with it a kind of hubris, overconfidence in the power and status of academic qualifications, the classroom, the lecture hall, that can too easily exclude the world of work. And look what's happened, for example, to vocational training. And the Babylonians required by law craftsmen to train up the next generation of craftsmen. That was a form of apprenticeship 1,000 years before Plato's academy. So eat your heart out, Plato. And 500 years ago in Europe, there was lots of vocational training going on in the form of apprenticeships. But actually it's a little bit different from what you would see in an apprenticeship now in England, for example. These apprenticeships were directly and managed and organized pretty well exclusively by employers. There weren't any colleges involved because the colleges didn't exist. Now today, a lot of vocational training all over the world, certainly here in the UK, has been much more taken over by a classroom approach, quite separate from the workplace. The apprenticeships in which most of the learning takes place in the context of productive work, those still exist in different forms in some countries, But there's something of an exception to this rule in the central place they give work-based learning. So even in the domain of vocational training, classrooms have come to dominate workplaces as training environments. So the academic culture has acquired quite extraordinary independence and power, and so that many of those working in the education industry, the teachers and professors, they often have no experience of working life outside academic institutions. They have moved seamlessly from school to university and back to school or university. I should say I want to provoke rather than offend in this presentation. And of course, that academic culture that I'm describing has achieved many great things, and I'm not going to be talking about them today. But the power of the academic culture, its dominance of learning, it doesn't actually help employer engagement. Now, what can we do about this? And some people say you can't change culture, but that's not true. It's difficult to change culture, but culture changes all the time, and it can be changed. And one way in which it can be changed, for example, is by getting employers into schools and other educational institutions. Historically, employers have been largely absent there. And that's something which the organizers of this conference in the Education and Employers Task Force have made a really fantastic contribution towards that very important task of opening up the doors of our education institutions to employers. Re-establishing work-based learning is also a key way in which the culture can be changed. For work-based learning, not just in the form of apprenticeship, but also in other ways, goes right to the heart of the issue. It's a powerful reminder that not all real grown-up learning takes place in the academy. Not all real grown-up learning is in a classroom or in a lecture hall, presided over by an academically trained teacher. Learning in the workplace, guided by practitioners, that ancient form of learning is very, very grown-up learning. And now we are somehow rediscovering this. It's a case of back to the future. And making work-based learning central, therefore addresses these cultural challenges very directly. Now, one other cultural issue, and people often complain that vocational qualifications have low status. This is and we need to make vocational training more attractive. Now, we need to be careful about this. I mean, in my view, it's a hopeless endeavor to seek so-called parity of esteem, this much-used phrase, between vocational qualifications and high-status academic qualifications. It's just not going to happen. We have to look for more feasible goals. For example, apprenticeship and practical occupational skills may never have the highest status of all, but they might at least be seen as being cool. And I use that word very deliberately. Now, apprenticeship won't be cool if it appears to be dominated or is dominated by rather old-fashioned, male-looking mechanical sets of occupations. It just looks too much like boys with their toys. And one of the great achievements of the World Skills Competitions has been to make vocational skills cool by linking them to a sporting event. So another way in which culture can be changed. So what about institutional barriers? We have lots of powerful groupings in the education industry, schools, organizations, university heads, teacher unions, lots of other groups that represent employers, but rather few to bridge the gaps. And there are some institutions that, rather than providing a bridge, may actually get in the way. They actually get between employers and the education and training providers. And just to choose one local example, in the UK, at least outside Scotland, the awarding bodies linked to the qualification system have done just that. A competitive market with a myriad of qualifications that's been very chaotic, in which employers, for very good reasons, have not wanted to get involved. And I'm really delighted to see that in just the last few weeks, the latest review by Lord Sainsbury and in the government's response, the government has agreed to implement a recommendation which we advanced 3 years ago in our OECD Skills Beyond School Review of England, recommending the creation of franchised monopolies of qualification creation in each of several separate vocational domains. And I know it's going to be hard to implement, but it's the right way to go. And in our view, it will help to re-engage employers because they'll know in each occupational sector who to talk to. So what more can be done with institutions? Bodies that bridge the gap between education and employers are desirable, but they don't always work. One key trick is to get the relation of government to employers right, and that's hard. You can't force employer engagement. Instead, you have to give employers the incentives to work with government and training providers, offer them something in return. And just to give one example, the Swiss federal diplomas, these are post-secondary vocational qualifications. And they have a kind of light touch government regulations that ensures that they're employer-led and that there's full employer buy-in. Employers have to take the initiative in creating these qualifications, otherwise the qualifications don't exist. And crucially, the qualifications won't get government support, government endorsement, and some funding, unless they can demonstrate that their proposed qualification has the support of the majority of industry in the relevant sector. So employers have an incentive to work together to establish vocational qualifications and to obtain the prestige conferred by being a Swiss federal diploma. And they do. It works. Now, social partnership institutions are important, and here people often refer to culture and institutions. It's often said it's really hard to export these arrangements that work well, obviously, in some parts of Europe. And generally, it is hard. It's very hard. And there's many examples of failure. But I just want to refer to one example of success just to show you that it's a little bit of a complicated picture. Around 25 years ago, a group of officials and political leaders from the US state of Washington paid a study visit to Germany and some other European countries to look at the social partnership arrangements, the way in which the trade unions and the employers work together with government to help run the vocational system. And these US officials liked what they saw, and they went back to the state of Washington, and they passed state legislation. And today, the Workforce Board in Washington state runs most of the vocational system, and it has tripartite representation of government, employers, and unions working together, social partnership style. So it can work. It probably wouldn't have worked in South Carolina, but in Washington state, given the right circumstance, the right politics, it can work. Now let's look at the economic barriers. There are some really big economic barriers to employer engagement. And in fact, I think these are the most important barriers of all. But at the same time, there you find incentives that can be tweaked, that can be adjusted, and into a form where they can help and rather than hinder employer engagement. Now, first of all, the first barrier is that the provision of skills is too often dominated by the interests of those who supply skills, rather than by the employers who use the skills. And just for example, in many countries, universities have used their market power to shoehorn a lot of education and training into 3- and 4-year bachelor level programs. Certainly have happened in the UK, But to give you an example from another country, in the Netherlands, they find it extraordinarily hard to scale up their 2-year foundation degrees. And that's not at all surprising, because they were trying to do that in the context of their universities of applied science, that are not at all keen on promoting something that competes with their larger, more profitable 4-year degrees. Another example, in Europe, nursing programs are now dominated by bachelor's level provision, and often squeezing out shorter programs. Interesting to see how that works. I remember in a professional college again in Switzerland, talking to them about their 2-year program, and I said, how can you run this 2-year program for nurses and provide exactly the same skills as the 3-year programs that are being run in the Fachhochschulen, in the universities of applied science down the road? And they said, it's very, very simple. We operate a normal holiday routine, 6 weeks a year. They have university holidays. Do the maths. 3 years becomes 2 years. And it's true. They have exactly the same routine on a weekly basis. They just squeezed it all into 2 years by taking normal holidays. Now, this whole process of qualification inflation is aided, it's reinforced by something that comes from students themselves and their parents. It's the preference for qualifications with higher status. For example, in Korea, baristas, the people who work in coffee shops, have tertiary qualifications. They take 2 years of training in junior college. I've tried the coffee. I think it's roughly the same as the very nice coffee I've just had outside. I don't think it takes 2 years to learn how to make that coffee. But of course, if you look at the international league tables for tertiary education, and here my employers in the OECD have a role to play, it doesn't help that countries get more points for longer programs that meet the criteria for a tertiary program. Certainly we count those baristas as tertiary. We don't count the skills. It's not exactly overeducation, it's just a form of inefficiency. And just by the way, you want to know why those students want to spend 2 years learning how to make a cup of coffee. Well, actually, coffee in Korea and coffee shops are really, really cool. They have the coolness that goes with a traditionally tea-drinking culture and with a new innovation, which is the whole Starbucks-style coffee shop. And they're super cool. So let me move on to talk a little bit about how the skills market that's too often dominated by the supply side, these powerful institutions like the universities, the way they're reinforced by student preferences for high status and longer programs. And all that tends to lock out employers. But it's also interesting to see that it's not universal. Some countries are more successful than others in tackling this, in providing a flexible range of shorter post-secondary qualifications. In the United States, certificate programs are shorter programs, often somewhere between 6 months and 2 years if they were pursued full-time. Actually, they're often pursued part-time. And certificates have actually been one of the fastest growing types of post-secondary qualification in the United States. And there are various reasons for that in the way that the US market works. But on the employer's side, too, there are also big economic barriers to engagement. Employers generally like to invest in things that they own, in their assets. And it's a cliche of modern management, but it's also a true cliche that the greatest asset of firms is often the people that they employ. But of course, those people, they're not really assets because they can walk out the door. And economists have long fretted about the market failure that means that employers don't care enough about training and skills because employers can't really own those skills. Interestingly, there are fewer problems with that in a place like Austria because of the very high level of labor market regulation. That reduces the mobility of workers. You may say that that's a bad thing, but one good effect is that it gives employers the incentive to get it right first time, with very well qualified recruits, often apprentice graduates. And for the same reason, there's strong employer interest in the nature of those qualifications. They can't afford to get it wrong because the cost in terms of the wages and getting rid of someone who hasn't got the right skills are very, very high, much, much higher than they would be, for example, in the UK or certainly in the United States. Now you put all those economic barriers together, the dominance of the supply side, the student search for status, the limited incentive for employers to care about the skills they can never own, and you get some formidable barriers. And actually, that's not all, because, of course, as I've been saying, these economic barriers often reinforce the cultural and institutional barriers. In places where there's no history or culture of employer engagement, and there are few institutions to support it, and the economics doesn't help. Quite often that's the way it is. But let's not get too downhearted. There actually are solutions. There are ways through all this. And one implication of this is that the solutions often need to engage with all of these dimensions to get the culture and the institutions and the incentives all working together. And here are some suggestions. Now, first of all, we have to work with the grain of economics. It's not realistic to expect employers to provide sustained engagement simply out of altruism. Engagement has to make economic sense for employers. That's for sure. And the second point is that work-based learning is a really, really key element in all this. And giving emphasis to work-based learning is a way of changing the culture because it makes a neglected and non-academic form of learning central. It's a way of establishing practical working partnerships between training providers and employers, building bridges. And the economics of work-based learning can be very attractive to employers once they recognize the economics. Now, it's interesting, there is a body of work on the economics of work-based learning, the costs and benefits of in apprenticeships. In particular, it comes out of Switzerland and Germany, in particular associated with the work of Stefan Wolter and Samuel Mullerman in particular. And in the OECD, one of the things we've been doing recently is to work with these colleagues to try and translate the messages coming out of this research into policy messages. And there's policy messages that are very important at two levels. One is to be able to advise government of where it makes sense for employers to invest in apprenticeships and where government can help with that. For example, with small and medium-sized employers. To what extent should government seek to support smaller employers in providing apprenticeships and work-based learning? That's a big issue. It's a big issue with the organisation of the levy in the UK, for example. But the other dimension in which costs and benefits are also very important is at the level of the individual employer. It's being able to say to an employer rather than, my goodness, vocational training is a good idea, isn't it? With a lot of happy-clappy words, if I can put them that way. It's actually being able to say, well, you would have these costs and these benefits, and they can be quantified. And in your case, it looked as if it might help your bottom line. That's really convincing to any employer. And the third suggestion here is to learn from success stories. Now, often you hear the success stories from kind of the usual suspects. I've talked about Switzerland a bit, and you've heard from Germany. But actually, it's interesting to go to Sweden, and Sweden's an example of a country where there's very little culture of employer engagement. There are very few institutions that assist employer engagement. And their new system of higher vocational education is very, very interesting because it was developed successfully against that background. And the key innovation is that this system funds not training providers, but partnerships between training providers and employers, with employers providing the work-based learning element of the program. So rather than employer partnership as something that's tacked on to a program, tacked on to a system as something that's wished for and you go out and search for, it's a precondition, it's a funding precondition. So the program in Sweden appears to have been very successful, and it's growing fast. And it's very interesting that a very similar scheme is now operating in a completely different country and environment, in Barbados, which is funded, and there it's being funded through the Inter-American Development Bank. And again, it appears to be being very successful. So, to conclude, it's not always going to be easy. In fact, it's going to be hard. It's going to be very difficult. But there are ways in which employers can be encouraged to approach and enter and participate in that sacred olive grove of academe, not with axes like General Sulla, but with partnership in mind. Thank you.